Hello, this is Chris Ferrara for Fatima Perspectives. In our last segment, we discussed the Synod of 2014. I outlined the problem of the Synod, the novelty of this idea that bishops meeting in Rome could discuss and debate matters of doctrine and practice in the Catholic Church as if the Church was some sort of democracy, and that doctrine and established practice could be changed by a vote made by a group of prelates assembled in Rome. The very concept is fraught with potential disaster for the Church. And I'm afraid we saw that disaster coming to pass at the Synod in October 2014. I spoke in the last segment about a rebellion of some of the Synod fathers, some of the prelates who were assembled in Rome against the manipulation of that Synod by the Synod controllers. The panel seating in front of the gathering, which consisted of Pope Francis and those he had appointed to oversee the proceedings, including Cardinal Baldisseri and Monsignor Forte, the author of the interim report that I mentioned in the last segment. The interim report that was not actually a product of the deliberations of the Synod Fathers, but was written by the Pope's hand-picked draftsmen, including Monsignor Forte, and which, unthinkably for the Catholic Church, suggested that the Church should be accommodating to so-called homosexual persons as such and accept and value their orientation, and that the Church should, for the first time in her history, admit to the sacraments of confession and Holy Communion people who had divorced, purporting to end valid marriages, and married another, which our Lord says is nothing other than the practice of adultery. This was, of course, unthinkable. And the rebellion that I spoke of was a rebellion by the Synod Fathers in the aftermath of the publication of this interim report, with its opening to so-called gays and essentially to public adulterers living in second marriages. The rebellion was occasioned by the fact that some of the Synod Fathers knew that the Synod was actually camouflage for an agenda that was being pushed by the Synod controllers. And I have to be frank and say that it was pretty obvious to anyone who was looking at the proceedings of the Synod from the little snippets of video and the photographs we saw, that the head controller of the Synod was none other than Pope Francis, who, press accounts revealed, was passing notes to the General Secretary of the Synod, Cardinal Baldisseri, throughout the proceedings, as if to tell him what to do at every given moment. Now, when the rebellion occurred, Cardinal Pell got up in the middle of the Synod proceedings and said the manipulation of this Synod must stop. And after that, basically the midterm report with its opening to gays and public adulterers was trashed by the actual Synod majority. Now, what I'm telling you is not some sort of hysterical post-mortem by some kind of radical traditionalist. Let me quote to you what Cardinal Burke, then head of the Apostolic Signatura, since removed by Pope Francis, tellingly enough, from that position. Here, let me quote to you what he said about the midterm report. The very disturbing midterm relatio, which I have openly said was not a relatio or report, but a manifesto, served to wake up the Synod Fathers to an agenda that was at work, which touches upon the truth about marriage. In the period between the midterm report and the final relatio, the small groups worked very diligently to try to repair the serious damage done by the midterm relatio. Consider carefully what this prince of the Church, who at the time was the head of the Church's highest tribunal, is saying about this midterm report. That it reflects an agenda, that it was in fact a manifesto, not an actual document of the Synod, and that this agenda, this manifesto, had nothing to do with what the Synod Fathers were supposed to be considering a defense of the family. What the midterm report revealed, quite frankly, is that the Synod of the family was actually camouflage for an attack upon the traditional family through this opening to so-called homosexual persons and through acceptance of the idea, in practice, so they say, leaving the doctrine unchanged, so they say, that public adulterers can be admitted to Holy Communion without renouncing their adulterous relationship. And as Cardinal Burke said, serious damage had been done by this document. This document, which we now know, was approved by Pope Francis for distribution to the press and publication on the Vatican website without participation by the Council Fathers. Now, let me give you a quotation from another prelate, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who, looking upon the events surrounding the midterm relatio, made this rather momentous declaration. Quote, "This is the first time in church history that such a heterodox text was actually published as a document of an official meeting of Catholic bishops under the guidance of a pope, even though the text only had a preliminary character." End quote. Now, the name Bishop Athanasius Schneider possesses is rather interesting, because Bishop Athanasius was one of the few Catholic prelates who stood fast during the 4th century against the Arian heresy, the heresy according to which Christ is not really the second person of the Holy Trinity, but rather an exalted creature much favored by God. In effect, much of the Catholic Church, it seemed at times nearly the entire Catholic Church, during the Arian crisis, had become the functional equivalent of today's Jehovah's Witnesses. And Bishop Athanasius and a few others were among the few in the hierarchy, along with, I should say, the courageous laity, who stood fast against this heresy for more than 50 years. This heresy afflicted the Church until eventually it was conquered and rendered a part of the Church's rather inglorious past. There have been some incidents in church history that involves crises that the Church has had to endure and overcome. Well, I think we're looking at another such crisis with the Synod of 2014, which threatens to become an even larger crisis with the next session of the Synod in 2015. And in that regard, it's important to talk about what has happened to Cardinal Burke since then. We know that after the Synod and after Cardinal Burke's role in opposing the manifesto of the midterm report and the agenda that was clearly being promoted against the family under the guise of a synod on the family, we know that Cardinal Burke was removed from his post as head of the Apostolic Signatura and given a titular position as the spiritual council of the Knights of Malta. That's an unprecedented insult administered by a pope to a high-ranking prelate in the Vatican dicasteries, or Vatican departments, in this case, the Church's highest tribunal. So a distinguished canonist, a world-renowned prince of the Church, courageous in his defense of orthodoxy, was brutally demoted because, let's face it, he stood up in defense of orthodoxy and orthopractice, the practice of the Church for 2,000 years, respecting the impossibility of admitting to Holy Communion divorced and remarried Catholics living in a state of public adultery. And Cardinal Burke has since then been quite courageous in continuing to defend the constant teaching and discipline of the Church. I'll cover that in the next segment of Fatima Perspectives.